Someone doesn't text back for 3 hours and you've already written the ending. Not a stranger, someone whose opinion of you actually matters. A friend, a colleague, someone you said something real to. Not consciously, not dramatically, just quietly in the background. While you were doing other things, your mind built a story. About what the silence means, about what you did wrong, about what's coming next. And by the time they finally respond with something completely ordinary, you've already lived through a version of events that never happened. You know this pattern. You've caught yourself inside it more times than you can count. The message that arrives late, and suddenly you're cataloging everything you said in the last conversation. The meeting that goes quiet, and the strangest part, the part nobody really talks about, is how convincing the story feels. How certain. How much it feels like simply seeing what's there, rather than constructing something that isn't there at all. The brain isn't designed to experience reality directly. It's designed to predict it. Every moment before you've consciously registered what's in front of you, the brain is already running calculations, using everything it knows from the past to generate a model of what's probably happening now. What you experience as perception is mostly prediction. The actual sensory information, what someone said, how they said it, what their face did, arrives after the model is already running. The brain fills in the gaps. It smooths over the ambiguity. It takes the incomplete information of a real moment and makes it feel complete, readable, certain. Which means the story isn't something that happens after you perceive reality. The story is how you perceive reality. And most of the time this works. The predictions are accurate enough. The model is close enough to what's actually there that the difference doesn't matter. But sometimes, in the moments that feel most charged, most uncertain, most connected to something you care about, the brain reaches further back into the past to build its model. It pulls from old experiences. From the time someone's silence did mean something. From the time the compliment did have something underneath it. From the time you were right to be worried, and often, more often than felt fair, you were. The mind isn't lying to you. It's doing exactly what it was built to do. The problem is that it was built for a world that no longer entirely exists. There is the story about what someone's behavior means about you. The friend who cancels plans, and suddenly it's about whether you're too much, whether you ask for too much, whether the friendship is slowly contracting in ways you're not supposed to notice yet. The colleague who doesn't respond to your idea in the meeting, and you spend the afternoon deciding what that means about your competence, your place, whether you read the room wrong again. The behavior belongs to them. The story lands entirely on you. There is the story about what your mistakes say about who you are. Not just that you did something wrong, but what doing something wrong reveals. The email sent with the wrong attachment becomes evidence. The conversation that didn't land becomes proof. The mind doesn't just register the error, it files it as data about your fundamental worth. And there is the story about what's coming. The anticipatory narrative, the one that builds entire futures from the smallest signals. The slight tension in someone's voice, and suddenly you're 3 conversations ahead, preparing for a version of events that may never arrive. You've been living in that future more than you realize. The stories aren't random. They circle the same fears. They protect the same wounds. They return, again and again, to the same question underneath all of them. Am I enough? And will they eventually figure out that I'm not? The stories didn't arrive from nowhere. Every story the mind tells now was learned somewhere. Built from something that happened before, something that taught the brain what silence means, what mistakes cost, what it looks like when things are about to go wrong. Most of those lessons were learned early. Before you had the language to question them, before you knew that what was happening in one room, with one person, in one specific set of circumstances, wasn't a universal truth about how the world worked. You were small, and something happened, and the brain filed it, not as one experience, as a rule. A prediction template. A pattern that said, when this happens, this is what it means. And the template has been running ever since. The mind that now reads 3 meanings into a delayed text learned that delayed responses meant something. not in the abstract, specifically. In a particular relationship, at a particular age, when someone's silence was something to be afraid of, someone whose approval organized your whole sense of whether the day had gone well. The mind that turns a single mistake into evidence about your worth learned that mistakes had that weight. That being wrong was costly in ways that went beyond the mistake itself. The story isn't irrational. It was rational once. It was the most accurate read available with the information you had at the time. The difficulty is that the information changed. The rooms are different now. The people are different. What silence means here, in this relationship, with this person, is genuinely different from what it meant then. But the template doesn't always know that yet. I read Lisa Feldman Barrett once, a neuroscientist who spent decades studying how the brain actually constructs emotion and experience, and one idea stayed with me longer than I expected. The brain is not a passive receiver of reality. It's an active constructor of it. Every perception, every emotion, every story about what's happening, the brain builds these from predictions, from past experience, from what it expects to find rather than what's actually there. She called it the predictive brain. If the brain constructs experience rather than receives it, then the stories your mind tells aren't just interpretations of reality. They're the material reality is made of for you in that moment. Which means changing the story isn't about being more positive or more rational. It's about giving the brain new material to build with. New moments where the silence meant nothing. New evidence that the mistake didn't define you, which is harder than it sounds when every new situation arrives pre-filtered through the old story. But accumulated slowly, over time, it updates the template, not through insight alone, through repetition, through accumulating enough moments where the old prediction was wrong, that the brain starts to build a different model. I find that both harder and more hopeful than I expected. Harder because it takes longer than understanding. More hopeful because it means the stories aren't fixed. They're just the most recent version. The cost. Not the dramatic cost. Not the relationships that ended or the opportunities that were clearly missed. The quiet cost. The one that accumulates in the background while you're busy managing everything else. The decision you didn't make because the story said it wasn't safe. The thing you didn't say because the story predicted it would land wrong. The room you didn't take up because the story had already decided you were too much for it. The version of yourself you didn't show because showing it felt like handing someone evidence. Most of the cost isn't visible. It lives in the gap between what you did and what you might have done if the story had been different. Between the version of you that walked into the room and the version that stayed in the doorway, editing. That gap has been larger than you've let yourself see. And the part I keep coming back to, not that the stories cause damage, but that so much of the damage looks like caution. Like being careful, like reading the room correctly and adjusting accordingly. From the outside it looks like self-awareness. From the inside it feels like wisdom. But sometimes it's neither. Sometimes it's just the old template, running quietly, making decisions on your behalf, before you've had a chance to make them yourself. All of it, the silence that means rejection, the mistake that means you're not enough, the future that's already going wrong, circles back to the same place. The story your mind tells about you. The situation isn't the subject, you are. About you specifically, what you are, what you're worth, what you're allowed to want, how much space you're permitted to take up before someone notices and decides it's too much. That story is the oldest one. The one running underneath all the others. It's the story that decides, before you've walked into the room, whether you belong there. The one that edits what you say before you say it, not for clarity, but for safety. That scans for signs of disapproval before you've given anyone a chance to approve. That preemptively makes you smaller so nobody else has to ask you to be. You've been writing that story for a very long time. And the hardest part is that it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like the truth. Like simply knowing who you are and what you're capable of and what you should reasonably expect. It feels like self-knowledge. But self-knowledge and the stories your mind tells about yourself are not always the same thing. Sometimes they are very different things indeed. So what do you do with all of this? not as a project, not as something to fix before you're allowed to feel okay about yourself. Just what do you do with the awareness that the mind is telling stories, that the stories came from somewhere, that they have been running the show in ways you didn't fully see? It starts with the moment between the story arriving and you believing it. That moment is very small. Sometimes it's barely there at all. But it exists, the fraction of a second where you could notice. This is a story. Not reality, not truth, not self-knowledge. A story the mind built from old material, doing its best with what it had. You don't have to believe every story your mind tells you. That sounds simple. The stories feel true. They arrive with the weight of certainty. Noticing them as stories, rather than facts, takes practice, and patience, and a willingness to keep returning to the moment between arrival and belief. But that moment is where everything shifts. That's the whole thing. Not the story. Not the history behind it. Not the work of changing it. Just the noticing. Just that small gap between the story and the truth. That was always enough. The mind will keep telling stories. That's not going to stop. 3 hours of silence and something will still flicker. A mistake will still arrive with more weight than it deserves. The room will still get read before you've decided how to read it. But there is a difference between a mind that tells stories and a mind that knows it tells stories. The second one has a small gap in it. A moment of noticing. A fraction of a second where the story is visible as a story, not invisible as truth. That gap doesn't fix everything. It doesn't silence the stories or resolve the history behind them or make the old template disappear. But it changes the relationship. And that changes everything that follows. I make these for the gap, for the moment before the story takes over, before the history behind it decides for you, before you've had a chance to choose. If something in here shifted something in you, subscribing means the next one will find you when it should. And if something landed, what story have you been believing that you're starting to question?